This Voice of San Diego podcast is brought to you by Manalatus Nelson Murphy, Advertising and Public Relations. As a nonprofit news organization, we depend on our members, foundations, and sponsors like M&M to provide funding to support the investigative journalism you expect from Voice of San Diego. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize them during the show. M&M is run by Tony Manalatus, Bob Nelson, and Kelly Murphy Lambkin, who bring a vast network and decades of experience to developers, public agencies, campaigns, and others. M&M bridges the gap between clients and the people whose influence matters most. M&M develops successful strategies and implements cost-effective tactics to help clients achieve their goals. The firm specializes in public affairs PR and advertising with an emphasis on media relations, crisis communications, community engagement, and cross-platform marketing. Our reporters at Voice of San Diego have heard from Tony and Bob a lot over the years. Tony, Bob, and Kelly are supporters of Voice of San Diego. Learn more about their firm at mnmadpr.com. And if you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor too, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
Welcome to the Voice of San Diego podcast. I am Andrew Keats, and I'm here with my good friend Sarah Libby.
What's up?
What up, bro? Hello to everybody listening on News Radio 600 Kogo. Sarah, I've got a proposal for you.
Give it to me.
This weekend, get your husband, I'll get my wife, get our babies, drive downtown, and we'll go for a swim at the Hilton waterfront pool on account of, as everybody knows, that is required per the hotel's land use agreement with the port to be a public pool for everyone, not just hotel guests. What do you say?
Everyone knows it.
Everyone knows that.
And we don't just know it, we know why it exists as part of this land use deal.
Yeah, very specifically because of the pedestrian bridge.
Right.
That, if we're going to build this expensive public works project to connect this private hotel and their residents or their guests to the gas lamp area, we should get something for that. And what we got, we drove a hard bargain and we got a deal. We got public access to their nice pool.
We did, except that we didn't.
Except
that's not true at all. It turns out, in a brave act of public service journalism that our friend Kinsey Moreland did this week.
Yeah, it's just not true. If you have been out there perpetuating this idea, it's not true. You're wrong.
Which everyone has.
Including hotel employees.
Including the hotel employees. I personally heard it from my husband, who heard it from a coworker.
Yeah.
And I think everyone in the city has a similar situation.
Yeah, I heard it from a friend who often took his family on Saturday afternoons. And he'd always be like, yeah, it's great. It's public. You can go. And
yeah, so this is the thing, is that It's not true, and yet lots of people actually have gone.
Which really, I have to admit, validates their belief in the myth.
Absolutely.
Because they had taken their bodies to the pool and were allowed to swim in the water.
But it turns out they were just pool crashing.
Yes, they were just breaking the rules, and for whatever reason, the hotel had decided for a long period not to care about it.
Yeah. And some of them hilariously have said, like, yes, this used to be a thing, but now it's not. So not only
very specific explanations,
Right.
like it just expired. Like it expired last year.
Very specific explanations for why it exists, and very specific explanations for why it no longer exists.
Yeah.
None of it is true or real.
Yeah, so check this out. So Kinsey Moreland did this story, and it was very funny talking to her as she initially started it, because she kept calling all these government agencies that were supposedly on the other end of this very shrewd deal.
Right.
Who kept just being like, no, we didn't. What are you talking about? That's not a thing. We never did that. So she has confirmed through the port that no such agreement ever existed. Through Civic San Diego, the former redevelopment agency that built the pedestrian bridge, that they made no such agreement. from the Coastal Commission, which is in charge of regulating coastal access throughout the state, that no such agreement existed, such that we're now confident saying that there is no such agreement of this kind.
I think so.
Yeah.
This was, by the way, part of our new service that we're trying out. It's called Hearken, where people can send in questions that they want us to answer and track down. And this was one of them that they voted on. And none of the stories that we talk about in the rest of the podcast will ever be as wildly popular as this one. Story about the Hilton hotel pool.
Yeah, so how it works is people submit questions about the city that they want answered. We put all those questions up for a public vote. Whichever one gets the most votes will be answered by one of our reporters for a new segment we call the People's Reporter. This was the first installment of it.
It went great, although I feel like we broke a lot of hearts.
I know. But
revealing this.
I feel like there's going to be a bunch of people who are like, hey, idiot, I did go swim in the pool.
Yeah, so you could still try doing it.
Keep trying doing it, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, well, speaking of other things that seemingly persist in spite of themselves, the remake of the Plaza de Panama.
Yeah, this is like from the bingo card that we could pull out to talk about at every podcast of civic issues that will be a thing that exists.
Yes, it's right. It's like it is the B7 to the stadium.
Today we drew Plaza de Panama.
All right, so what is going on with the Plaza de Panama now, Sarah?
Well, it's not cleared of cars yet, as the plan is.
Right.
But Lisa Hallerstadt gave us an update this week that on Monday, one of the 2 lawsuits against the project is going to trial. Mm-hmm. And this is the one that Corey Briggs has filed. So
there are 2 lawsuits, right? There's Briggs's lawsuit, and then there's one from the Preservationist
Save Our Heritage organization. Yeah. And so the city already largely won that lawsuit in court, but it's now on appeal. So it's still sort of winding its way through the process. And so the city says that it, is very confident that it's going to prevail. But one thing that I thought was really fascinating that Lisa surfaced was that in a lot of these court filings for both lawsuits, the city and other people who are working on the project are starting to express a lot of alarm that, like, the longer this gets dragged out, the more and more it's going to cost, to the extent that it could even threaten the project. So there are things like, interest rates that fluctuate. These new tariffs could be a problem. And so they're saying, like, don't delay this anymore.
Yeah, and throughout the state, construction costs are going up, and
right.
For labor, not just materials.
So they're starting to worry that the longer and longer this gets dragged out, there have been requests to postpone this trial, that it could be in more danger.
And so while the trial side of things sorts itself out, the legal end of the dispute, is it a budgeted project? Does the city have the money to do this? Do we know that?
Unclear.
I
know that a big part of the money is also coming from philanthropists, and so they're involved as well. And I think that that's actually part of the challenge.
Yeah, it's probably hard to fundraise for a project that's caught up in court.
And also, I think that there's legal issues with that Corey Briggs is challenging, that some of the financing didn't go through the proper processes. I'm not sure.
The actual fundraising?
I don't know.
Okay, fair enough. It's fine. You didn't write the story.
It's a lot.
Okay, so Maya Srikrishnan, I'm gonna give a little compliment to our reporter here. I think she's done a stellar job of covering
absolutely
the what's going on with border and immigration cases right now.
Yeah, and not just in San Diego, but I think highlighting a lot of these issues that are in federal court all over the southwestern border.
Yeah. And so she had a story this week about a new case against the federal government that, if they were to prevail, would be a real change to the zero tolerance and Operation Streamline policies that the federal government has pursued in terms of hastening its process of deporting people.
Yes, sort of. So this isn't a lawsuit against the federal government. This is one of the prosecutions that the government is doing of every single person who crosses the border. They're charging with crimes, right? So most people plead guilty, or they say, the Border Patrol agent who arrested me lied, or they're dismissed for all kinds of different reasons. And so one of these people is arguing, well, first of all, I shouldn't have been arrested to begin with because I requested asylum. And there's a long-standing legal question about whether you can criminally charge somebody who's asked for asylum. And a lot of legal expertise out there seems to think you cannot. And so what Maya has discovered is that the fact that many of these people have asked for asylum is not in any of these documents. And so the court is completely oblivious to the fact that these people have asked for asylum. And if they knew that, a judge might be inclined to throw out the case.
Right.
And so the government says, well, that's private information and we're protecting their privacy by leaving it out. And this person's attorney is arguing, well, if you wanted to protect their privacy, you could use their initials, you could file something under seal, but you're claiming you care about their privacy while criminally charging them with crimes and using this against them.
Yeah. And so this is information that is not making it into the materials before in somebody's case in a system that is already doing things like holding mass hearings, hundreds of people at a time, transporting people back and forth many, like 2 hours away. So what would, if this one case was to prevail, that you must disclose this information in somebody's case, how would it play out in the immigration court system such as it is under this Operation Streamline policy, where we're trying to, because everybody gets charged with criminal or with misdemeanor offenses here, and as a means of facilitating more deportations, how would entering this information into that equation work within that system?
I think it could have a profound impact. I mean, if a judge knew that somebody had requested asylum and requested it in the right way, because, maybe if they didn't bring up that they want asylum until, a week after they were arrested, then that wouldn't stack as heavily in their favor. But if they encountered an immigration official and the second they encountered that person said, I want to speak to someone, I want to request asylum in the United States, then I think that would weigh really heavily with a lot of judges who would say this case shouldn't be here at all. Right. You can't charge someone with a crime who's requested asylum.
And the other way I wonder about it playing out is so many of these people have no representation.
Right.
Right. And they're
well, I think they all get a federal public defender. But there have been, massive issues with these people. The defenders are juggling multiple cases.
They don't even get to have a conversation with their client before they're in the courtroom.
They might not be able to speak with them without the help of an interpreter. And so, there are a lot of these barriers. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so that's interesting. Do we have any sort of sense on when that claim will be sorted out and when a judge might rule about this question?
So I don't have an exact day, but it is part of an Operation Streamline thing, which means it will probably move very quickly. Mm-hmm. I can say that, so when the court asked the government to explain why are you leaving this information out, it did provide an explanation, and it filed it under seal, meaning we can't have access to it. It's not public. And so we asked our attorney, Voice of San Diego, to draft a letter to the court asking the court to make that public. We think that if the government is going to obscure this information, it should have to explain why publicly. And so who knows whether they'll even take that into account. We're not a party to the case or anything. But I think knowing what the government says would be very interesting, and knowing how much weight the judge gives it will be very interesting. And so we're just waiting for it all to play out.
It is increasingly clear that very few people had any sense of how the immigration court proceedings worked in this country. And I think feels like a lot of people are learning together about how this all works.
Yeah, and like the way that the system's been set up, there's this merging of criminal cases and immigration cases, which are separate systems.
Yeah.
But people are being forced to, defense attorneys have to know immigration law and vice versa, and they're just melding together in really weird ways that are causing all these problems.
Okay, Sarah, we're going to move on to something that is near and dear to your heart, our hero of the week.
All right, so this week's hero is Jonathan Gold, longtime food writer for LA Weekly and the LA Times, who died this week. And I know that he's an LA guy, but I think that he was just such a fantastic ambassador for all Southern California and Southern California cuisine, and especially just really special little hole-in-the-wall places, of which we have so many in San Diego. And not just that, but also just somebody who was a mentor to so many young journalists and who answered every email he got, took every request somebody gave him, and was just such a special person. So I picked out a Jonathan Gold quote that I thought San Diegans would appreciate. And it says, entire religions have been founded on miracles less profound than the Ensenada fish taco.
That's a good line. That is a good line. The thing I like about Jonathan Gold, it's become sort of a tradition here in Southern California to snark on East Coast depictions of Southern California, specifically
Absolutely.
the New York Times
Yes.
depictions of Southern California. And while those things are silly and do deserve to be dunked on, and I'm glad that they are representative of an entire way of a certain class of East Coast people and how they view Southern California as this either like a frivolous endeavor for unserious people or just a mistake.
Yes.
This entire experiment out here is just a mistake waiting to blow up in our faces, and sooner or later we'll all realize that the right way to settle California is to not do it at all. And Jonathan Gold seemed to have such a clear rebuttal to that, and such a simple and romantic understanding of why that's so wrong and what makes Southern California great, in a way that wasn't pretentious. It wasn't highfalutin. It was just a simple, unapologetic description of why he liked this place so much. That I wish those New York Times writers just read him before they decided to write about avocado toast or whatever.
Yeah, and they had like an embarrassing faux pas just this week where the New York Times published a big travel piece about Los Angeles spiritual retreats, and the writers stumbled upon Olvera Street, one of the oldest streets in Los Angeles and just a place of such rich cultural significance, and just dismissed it as a place full of junk and stupidity in one sentence.
Yes.
And they had to come out with an entire story apologizing for that. And I think that shows the importance of Jonathan Gold so much.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, anyway, rest in peace. This is a real shame. Our GOAT of the week.
You lose! Good day, sir!
Okay, so this is a sticky one, but this one goes to the County Board of Supervisors. So they were left this week to make a decision on whether to put a ballot measure on, or an initiative, I should say, on the November ballot that would change the way the county holds its elections. Specifically, it would make all elections determined in November as opposed to being able to win outright in a primary if you get over 50% of the vote.
Yep.
Very similar reform was passed at the city of San Diego 2 years ago. This is unquestionably and very simply a boon to Democratic electoral hopes. Now, the people who support it would also tell you, well, it's also a boon to representative democracy, because then we'll be making decisions when most people vote. But there is just no question that at the present time, it helps Democrats get elected and hurts Republicans.
Yes.
The Board of Supervisors, everybody, all of which are Republicans, did not vote to put that measure on the ballot.
After people moved heaven and earth to fix the mistakes that they thought were going to prevent this from getting on the ballot.
Right. And so
they fix those things.
Yes.
And it's still not going on
yeah,
the ballot.
I mean, it's, you know, I think at least 80,000, maybe 100,000 people signed an initiative to put this measure on the ballot. This is, which, look, say what you want about initiatives. Initiatives are part of San Diego and California governance at this point.
Big part.
And people really, you ask them, they really actually want to be able to vote on these things. The
yes.
polling on these on this opportunity is very high. So instead of putting the measure on the ballot, just putting it on the ballot, the county greenlit a study, an impact study, to see how this would affect elections, which won't come back for 30 days. That puts it back at the August 7th meeting of the County Board of Supervisors. So that's the earliest they could, after getting this study, decide to put it on the ballot. However, it is believed, there might be a legal challenge to this, but it is believed that it takes 2 readings. I mean, you have to vote on it twice, which would put the second reading after the August 10th deadline to appear on this November's ballot, which means, based on basically a technicality, they're going to end up voting on this in 2020 instead of 2018. That, of course, is relevant because Kristen Gaspar, the chair of the Board of Supervisors, is up for re-election in 2020. And if this doesn't go before voters until 2020, it will not be in effect. Were it to be approved by voters in the first place, it would not be in effect when Kristen Gaspar goes up for re-election. That is a boost to her re-election hopes.
Yeah, I mean, the bottom line is that an all-Republican group kept off the ballot a measure that could help Democrats. And I think the validity of the measure is kind of irrelevant here.
Yeah.
Whether you think it's good or not, that's the kind of thing you should be able to weigh in on with your vote.
Have a robust debate about it. In fact, we hosted a robust debate on this very similar topic at PolitiFest in 2016,
right?
When the city was engaging on this. And frankly, there were good arguments to be made that this is bad policy.
Sure.
And you should feel free to make those.
Right. Absolutely. Let's have the debate.
Yeah.
Let's, if you think it's a bad measure, tell us why. But I think it's just very clear that this was, politicking to help
procedural
themselves.
Gimmicks, right?
Absolutely.
All right. That's all we got. Stick around. We have Morgan Cook, the reporter from the Union Tribune. She had a great story this week on the county's foster care system and a truly horrific case that went through that process and revealed a lot of potential problems in the system in general. She's going to be here to talk about all of that.
Yeah, keep in mind as we do this interview that I am the only member of this group that has not been named San Diego's Journalist of the Year in the last 15 months or so. So, keep all my questions through that lens as you listen to it.
Yet we've got you coming on
editors
that.
Are journalists too, guys.
That's right. All right, stick around, and thank you to our friends on News Radio 600 Kogo.
This Voice of San Diego podcast is sponsored in part by Competitive Edge Research. As a nonprofit news organization, Voice of San Diego depends on our members, foundations, and sponsors like Competitive Edge Research. We are very grateful for all of our supporters, and we will recognize their support during the show. Competitive Edge Research, San Diego's premier public opinion research firm, sponsors this podcast because they like good journalism as much as they like good polling. Since 1987, Competitive Edge has helped clients see the why buried deep within the numbers. Competitive Edge designs comprehensive research studies, collects bulletproof data, and employs robust analytics so you'll understand why things are the way they are. Competitive Edge. Know what to do. And if you like Voice of San Diego's work and want to become a sponsor, contact us at development@voiceofsandiego.org.
And we are joined in the great Voice of San Diego podcast studio with UT reporter Morgan Cook. Morgan, what's up?
Very little. How are you?
Very little. All right, good. So you had a really great story that ran on Sunday morning. So we wanted to have you in to talk about it. It's basically about a particularly terrifying case that you found related to the county's foster care program and problems related to that program and just generally how it's handled here in San Diego. Maybe we could start out, you could just tell us in broad strokes, what were the details of the case that you found and that kind of served as the basis of your story?
Okay, so the case is a civil lawsuit that was brought by twin boys here in San Diego. They're identified as AG and MG. Mm-hmm. And AG was placed into foster care when he was 5 years old. And he was sent to live with a single parent, and his name was Michael Jerome Hayes. And so shortly after he arrived there, he complained that Hayes was hurting him, and he wanted to go to a different home. And his social worker, according to this lawsuit that the boys have filed, just didn't believe him or doubted his story, I guess. And so then things started to kind of escalate from there. There were more reports from the child and from, I guess, his mother and others. So then they placed another child in Hayes' care, and that child was identified as AH.
Mm-hmm. So this is a third kid, not one of the twins.
Right.
Okay,
and so then after that, the twins' mother was arrested. She had custody of MG. Mm-hmm. This was in 2008. And so then MG was placed with Hayes, even though, their mother was like, oh no,
yeah,
please don't do that. I think he's, abusing my other son. Please don't put this other son in danger. So
yeah, and so one of the things that comes through is that this mother, she maintained a relationship with the boys. They were living in foster care, but from what I gather, she never lost touch with them. There was some sort of relationship that maintained. Is that right?
Right. The foster care system tries when they can to help children who've been removed from their homes still maintain relationships with their families. Mm-hmm. And so I think that there was an effort to make that so. And also when it was just AG,
yeah,
and his twin was still with their mother, he got visitation with his twin during that time. Mm-hmm. And when they visited at Hayes' house, MG claimed that they were abused.
Yeah. And so there were, I think, maybe you have the number, there were a number of times that someone said something about the belief that there was something going on here.
And multiple people.
And yeah, different, unrelated to one another, independently. Do you have a count of the number of different issues that were raised, something like that?
The count that I have is based on the reports that are described in the lawsuit. Mm-hmm. I went through the lawsuit and I made a little timeline and I wrote down each indication that there was a report. But I think that there may be more because the source documents were not available to me.
I see. So roughly, there was 6 or 7 opportunities, I would say, that somebody was not just a stray comment, but an official report that required some sort of action on the part of the county's protective services.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So one of the things that jumped out to me is that you talk about that research has identified these sorts of risk factors that increase the likelihood, or at least potentially increase the likelihood of a child being abused. Low socioeconomic status, single-parent households with multiple kids, all of which were present in this one situation, and yet still these reports were not going anywhere. Were you able to see, does the county have any sort of system that weighs these factors at the front end when they're deciding when they're vetting their potential foster parents?
Yes, there is a system in place that they use to vet the foster parents and the foster parents' home, right? So they need to make sure that the home itself is a safe place. Mm-hmm. And, when they do that, they might find that it's not perhaps the perfect situation, but it's not like they have a million amazing foster parents to choose from, so they're looking at a situation where we have these kids, if we put them in this home, they will stay together. The reports haven't been substantiated, so we could still, they could grant a waiver, I guess, sort of make an exception to say, okay, well, we realize that these factors exist and it's not ideal, but it's what's available. Right. Right.
One of the most frustrating things that came up for me when I was reading your story were these accounts of when a social worker would try and investigate one of these claims, try to interview AG or anyone else involved, and he was in the principal's office, he wasn't available, or he didn't want to talk, and that was that. It sounded like there wasn't much follow-up beyond just, well, we tried and couldn't talk to anyone, so it didn't go anywhere. Do you get the sense that that's typical, or is that not how it's supposed to work?
How it's supposed to work is a very good question. It's not a question that I have great answers to because it's the subject of fairly, constant litigation.
Right.
But, as an outsider looking in, I can say that it doesn't make sense to me that you would not talk to the, suspected victim every single time, that you would not sit there and listen to them every single time. But, it also makes a certain amount of sense because sometimes children who are abused are unwilling to admit that they have been abused, that they are being abused. They're scared, they've been threatened, and foster children are afraid because, if they go from a tough situation to another tough situation, what reason do they have to believe that if they get themselves out of that frying pan, they won't end up in the fire?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I mean, the one that really stood out viscerally was there was a report the child protective services worker went to the school to try to talk to him, and he just buried his face in his hands and wouldn't answer any responses. It's like that, and then she writes it as unsubstantiated.
Shouldn't that be just as much of a red flag as reason to walk away?
Right. It seems like, the human response seems to me in that situation to be, something is really wrong here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because to me I don't have kids. Yeah. I don't know a ton about kids, but I do feel like if I were in that situation and I asked a child about abuse and the child just buried his face in his hands and wouldn't talk about it, I would say this is not normal. We need to take a closer look here. But they have a certain amount of resources, and I understand. I don't understand.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, sometimes. No, sometimes the most you could say is I don't understand. I think so. On the question of resources, I found myself thinking when I was reading the story that on the one hand, you talk to this expert, Jill Barrick from UC Berkeley, and she says that there's just this strong norm, this cultural norm to weight the statements of adults over the statements of children, and that it's a fairly difficult thing to overcome, and we just know that is the way that things happen in the real world. And then shortly after you mentioned that there's 400 protective services workers in the county, and they each have, give or take, 17 cases at a time. And I wonder, is this a question of resources potentially, or is this, a question of priorities that we could deal with through spending? If there's this strong cultural norm that's hard to overcome that weights adult voices over children, well, would that be addressed potentially if every child protective services worker had 5 case files at a time instead of 17? Do you see what I mean? Is it a numbers game, or is it a question of this just being a very difficult job?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that it's a combination of things, and I think that that the idea that what one really needs to do if they're going to find out what the problems are, find out how to address them? Do we need to figure out how to address them using the resources that we have available? Do we need to figure out how to address them and then get the resources that we need to do that? It's a question that has to be answered to me. I mean, I think with investigation, it starts with having a close look at the system, saying, what would help us the most? What could we do? What changes could we make that would really, we think, help us a lot? And then if we need more resources to do that, we go ask the voters, hey, can we please have more resources to do this?
Right.
And try to kind of sell it to them as opposed to saying, okay, well, what is the best we can do with what we have? It might need to be more like, how can we get what we need to do our best?
In any complicated story like this, there's always all kinds of things that get left on the cutting room floor that you're not able to get in. And one thing I found myself really curious about as I read the story is about the twins' mother. And you mentioned that I think AG was taken away after she brought him to a hospital for an illness that he had. And that seemed strange to me. I'm sure there's maybe more to it than that. And that the other twin was taken away after an instance of check fraud, which I also found strange. Did you get the sense that these kids were taken away hastily, or that maybe she had a good case to take care of them, or was there a lot more about her that we didn't know?
I mean, I think that, she was troubled. She had arrests. She had a difficult situation, I think. And social workers identified a problem there and decided that it just wasn't safe. And I don't have enough information to try to make that kind of call. But when I was reporting this story, I was thinking to myself, oh, well, what if the original situation that the kids were in was so bad that they just had to do something, at the available opportunity. And I just sort of started to kind of back away from that question because to me, the heart of what concerns me is that for whatever reason, they did take the kids and when they took them, they promised to protect them.
Right.
And they placed them with someone who hurt them and admitted to hurting them. And they tried to say that they were being hurt and nobody listened to them. And then that person pleaded guilty to doing what they said that he did.
Yeah.
And to me, I don't know the reason why it happened. And I don't know if everybody did everything by the book. It doesn't seem that way to me, but I don't know. It's at this point, it's allegations and stuff. But I can tell you that I think it's pretty clear that a problem exists if the county takes children, places them with someone, the kids say that they're being hurt, nobody does anything until the person is arrested, and then that person admits to hurting them. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, and I there's something interesting. Sarah, you mentioned something triggered in the system to get the kids out of their biological home, right?
Right.
So there's some sort of, however that system works, something spun into motion, and then yet it didn't with the foster parent, right? Like the system got the Rube Goldberg machine of county government got fired up when this mom brought her kid to the hospital for an illness that maybe seems like maybe only comes about through some sort of neglect, right? It got fired up again for check fraud, but allegations of sexual abuse, allegations that there was like a pungent smell of urine in the house, allegations that there were cockroaches everywhere in the home, and that the kids were, if I'm not mistaken, they were sexually acting out in school, right?
Yeah, and just in their sort of social and domestic lives as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so like one thing did trigger a response, and the other thing didn't, and I don't know what that tells us about the system, but it's like there's only a certain it takes an act of official government to trigger a response, whereas these sorts of complaints don't rise to that level for one reason or another.
I also found that interesting, and I wondered about it, and I looked into it. But yeah, I noticed that same thing, and I don't know what it means, but I did notice it.
Yeah.
It did stand out.
Well, maybe here's one way to get at it. you explain the concept in your story of discretionary immunity. Mm-hmm. What is that?
Okay, so social workers have a really hard job, like a really, really hard one. And they have to make a lot of these judgment calls as part of their job, right? And so the law gives them these duties that they have to do. You know, they have to go visit once a month, or, you know, and there are very certain things that they have to do. But when they go visit once a month, for example, then it's at their discretion what comes of that, right? So they go, they decide who they need to talk to. They decide, you know, if they're concerned, what concerns exist. They decide whether to intervene. Those are all decisions that they have to make based on what they see, what they know, their gut feeling about it, and then also all of these criterias. There's, you know, sort of ways that they are able to assess risk. They have models and things to do that, so they use those. But it's very much like decisions that they just have to make, and they have to make them quickly. And so, yeah, they are humans, and they're gonna make wrong choices, or choices that other people would say are wrong. People are going to challenge their choices, and they could be sued. Oh my goodness, so much. If the law did not protect them so that they could be allowed to do their job. Now, whether that is too much discretion, whether they have too much protection, whether that creates a situation where they can say, well, we went through the motions, and did we do a good job? No. Were children harmed? Maybe, you know, yes, but they said, well, we did try. We did do the mandatory duties. So, you know, it's kind of we want to protect the social workers, but we also want to make sure that they're, you know, that people are held accountable. So it's hard.
Yeah, I mean, it almost, the way it's wielded in the county's filing, becomes an almost infallible legal defense. Like we cannot be held responsible so long as we meet these required benchmarks.
Mm-hmm. And my understanding is that these are really hard cases to win. And, you know, that could be a reason why there aren't as many as one might think that they would see, or, but they are difficult cases to win, because you do have to show that they were required to do this step, that the law affirmatively said you have to do this, and they either didn't do it, or, you know, and they failed at that particular duty. So it takes a really skilled lawyer who handles these kinds of cases and is super familiar with making these kinds of cases. Otherwise, they can just fall right apart.
I would imagine that somebody pleading guilty and being in jail would help their case.
I know.
I don't know.
Yeah. So the county's legal response was pretty galling in a lot of ways. Now, you know, I understand that their client is the county and they need to win their cases, but they do describe a 7-year-old boy and his 10-year-old brother, who we now have pretty good evidence to have been victims of sexual abuse. The county's response calls that 7-year-old boy and that his 10-year-old brother unreasonable, careless, and negligent. And that it is their unreasonableness, their carelessness, and their negligence that resulted in what happened to them. That is, it's a hard thing to swallow. It's a hard thing to see a government making that case. It reminds me, we saw the city attorney in San Diego make a very similar argument against Jane Doe when she was sexually abused by a police officer. Mm-hmm. Did you talk to any sort of child abuse or legal experts about their reaction to that argument by the county?
I did, because I thought to myself, am I reading this correctly? But I mean, I always ask myself that when I read lawsuits, am I reading this correctly? Am I interpreting it? It's not, but I did read it and think to myself, oh, okay. And I think that part of it comes down to when you go to defend your client in the sort of civil litigation, you want to make sure that you do as much defense as you can. You know, you give yourself the best defense that you possibly can, and it's a defense, and I don't know how well it goes over, I guess. Yeah. But
I think it can backfire. You know, I talked to some attorneys after the Jane Doe argument, and they essentially said, you do what you have to do to defend your client. But I do think, especially if it's going to a jury, these are humans, probably some of whom have kids. And even if you don't, those things are probably going to have an impact.
Yeah. I wonder if a county government should be held to a different.
That's absolutely right.
A different standard. I mean,
you have a fiduciary duty to taxpayers, but at the same time, I, as a taxpayer, don't want someone in my name,
right,
making accusations about a 7-year-old who was abused.
Right,
certainly,
and presumably it has some sort of, or at least potentially has some sort of chilling effect on other victims and their willingness to come forward if they know that they're going to be tarred as, careless and negligent as 7-year-olds.
I've seen, Nathan Fletcher, who's running for supervisor, bring this up in his campaign, as, any politician probably would. But have you seen any other reaction from officials as to next steps or whether they plan to address these kinds of issues in any way?
I haven't seen a lot of it yet, which doesn't really surprise me a lot because the litigation is ongoing, right. And they don't want to harm their case, the taxpayers' case. They're trying to protect the taxpayers, and I get that. So at this point, there's not going to be a lot of this was definitely wrong, and the allegations are definitely true, and we need to act now, and we're prepared to do that because this is yet to all unfold, be proven, be decided, and I think that they just don't want to jump the gun. And I can see that.
Well, let me ask you one other thing. So you had a graph that was interesting about how the state measures essentially like the performance of, or the state of foster care systems on a county by county basis. It's like substantiated incidents per 100,000 foster care hours.
Days.
And so that creates this one number that you can compare county to county with. And San Diego was above some, below some, just a tick above or a tick below the state average. I think I had it right. Mm-hmm. What do you, in your mind, what does that measure? What are they measuring with that number specifically? Is it the performance of the foster care system and how well they're doing at substantiating crises, or is it a measure of like the socioeconomics of a region and a number of cases that may or may not come forward? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I think that the measure is designed to try to get a feel for how often we know that children are abused while they're in foster care, and not necessarily by their foster parent or anyone in the home. It could be they're abused by some, outside person, beyond the. So, but the idea is to sort of get a feel for how often are children mistreated in foster care, and I have questions about it because whether a claim is substantiated, whether an allegation is substantiated or not, there's a lot of discretion involved there, right, as this lawsuit seems to suggest. And so, it's hard for me to tell and to be confident that measure shows me what's really going on as far as the incidence of the rate of children being mistreated in foster care, or if it tells us something different, like the rate at which we substantiate allegations of children.
Yeah, it seems like it puts there's an odd power imbalance where it's like, you are in control of lowering your number,
right, simply
by not investigating cases thoroughly.
It seems like
potentially.
It seems like that could definitely happen.
Yeah.
And I don't know I don't know how good the measure is. I don't know exactly what it tells us, but it does seem like there's room to make numbers say what you want them to. Perhaps. Right. I am not saying that is going on.
I know, but as a measurement question, right?
Right.
Right. Okay, before we let you go, can you give us? You've done a number of other stellar investigations in recent years. One of those, our good friend Congressman Duncan Hunter in Alpine. Mm-hmm. Where do we stand right there on that question right about now?
Well, right about now, as far as we know, the federal investigation remains ongoing. He was top placed in the primary. So he will be facing off with a challenger in November. And I don't know right now where the investigation stands, and it's hard to tell based on the amount of money that that his campaign is spending on lawyers, because he's set up this legal expense fund. And the legal expense fund, the reports that say, how much money has come in, who gave it, who it's been going out to, that isn't out yet. It'll be out at the end of the month. So
end of the month.
Yeah.
So just in a couple days here.
Should be.
It's exciting.
But I mean, it has to also go through the process and then become available to the public and stuff. But yeah.
Something to look forward to.
Something to look forward to. All right, Morgan Cook, thank you for coming on. Stellar work. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Voice of San Diego podcast. This show is part of the Voice of San Diego podcast network. Visit voiceofsandiego.org/podcast to learn more about our education podcast, Good Schools for All, and our partner shows Beer Talk Radio, the Kept Faith Sports Podcast, and the rest of the shows in the network of local podcasts.